So I absolutely adore Japanese horror movies, and when I was lucky enough to live in Japan last year, one of the movies I was introduced to it is this Kwaidan from 1965. It was nominated for an Oscar. It's 3 hours, 4 terrifying tales, and it's actually based on a horror book written by a guy who used to live down the road from me on Lower Gardner Street. That book is also called Kwaidan. It's written by a guy called Laycadio. And up until quite recently, this book was actually taught in English class in Japanese schools across the country. But here in Dublin, we've no idea who he is. So I decided to do a 2-hour documentary about him for Lyric FM with about 16 gigs of information, lots of interviews. I'm going to try and squeeze his life to the next 4 minutes. So, he was born on the island of Laycadia in Greece. His father was the Surgeon General. He was stationed in Greece. He met his Greek mother. She was illiterate. She was beautiful. They fell in love, had Laycadio, but the marriage wasn't to work out. When they moved back to Dublin, they separated and abandoned poor Laycadio to be raised by his grandaunt. His grandaunt sent him to boarding school. While he was in boarding school, he lost sight in his left eye when he was knocked in the eye by a knotted rope. Now, this changed the way, not only the way he viewed the world, but also the way he viewed himself. So he had to literally feel his way around the room. He would have to read and write from a raised table, which is a replica of the table that he used. And he also never met the camera head on. He felt that he was a Cyclops. But while he was recovering in London, things went worse. His grandaunt went bankrupt, and instead of going back to boarding school, he was sent to London's East End to live with a former maid. While he was there, he would have been exposed to pretty grim scenes that he wrote back to friends back home. But this actually prepared him for what was going to come next. He got a one-way ticket to Cincinnati, where he would start working for a local newspaper. He joined the police beat, and he basically started writing about the macabre, the dark topics that were very popular at the time. But it wasn't all bad. He met a lady called Mattie Foley, who was black, and she introduced him to black culture and the vibrant, rich music scene of Cincinnati. He would have been using words like the breakdown in dance music or cribs, people's cribs, 120 years before MTV realized that it was cool. But she was black, and it was actually illegal to marry a colored person at that time, so he had to hightail out of New Orleans and make his way out of Cincinnati, make his way to New Orleans, where he introduced the world to Creole culture. But Japan, I suppose, really is where his biggest step would become. Now, Japan is a bit of an enigma at this stage. It had cut itself off from the world for 250 years, so nobody really knew what was happening. And then in about 1851, the borders were opened, and a lot of Japanese art flooded all over America and Europe, influencing everybody from Monet to Vincent van Gogh. Everybody suddenly wanted to understand what is it that makes Japan tick. Hearn realized that the answers didn't actually lie in the cities of Japan, which were becoming more and more westernized, but in the remote west of Japan. So he hightailed it out of Tokyo, and he went to the far west to Matsue, which was like the holy grail of old school Japan. Matsue is the chief city of the province of the gods. Its legend has it, it contains the gateway to the underworld. And it also has got amazing tombs and graveyards, and it's an amazing place for stories. And he started collecting these ghost stories, which he really understood was a great way to try and interpret Japan. Because in this book, basically, Glimpses of Unfamiliar Japan, he was capturing a lot of the traditions, a lot of the customs, a lot of the folklore through his ghost stories, and capturing a way of life that was really disappearing from Japan as it was being westernized. Now, when I say Hearn interpreted Japan, he didn't actually really speak any Japanese. So he met his wife, Setsuo Koizumi, who was a daughter of a samurai, and she was an amazing storyteller. She told him all these little, the traditions, the customs, the folklore of Japan, and helped him understand it, which he went on to create over 15 books in 14 years. And this is from a guy who could only see out of his left eye. He couldn't really speak Japanese, and he was only there for 14 years. So he also introduced the world to the word tsunami in a story called A Living God. And even until this day, that same story is taught to communities across the Pacific to prepare them for tsunamis and how to survive a tsunami. But it's Matsue, the city where he's basically, I visited, that's where he's remembered the most. You can literally read the comic book, drink the beer while wearing the t-shirt and walking around taking in all the sights. Because Laycadio, I suppose, even though he was that Cyclops that he turned his, this is an image of him turning his back on the West, which you see everywhere, and beginning his new life in Japan. Even though he only had sight in one eye, Laycadio really became the lens through which people could understand Japan, and he still is relevant today as he was 120 years ago. Thank you very much.